Hi there, my name is Will Niven. I'm a consultant in emergency medicine, and I'm going to chat to you today a little bit about how to analyse a problem for the purposes of the FR Chem Quip. There are two main objectives over here. Firstly, defining the tools that will help you to understand a problem, and then to give some focused examples of how you might use that in practice. And as with all good QI, you always start with a problem and don't try and just start. Don't try it with your interventions and solutions before you fully understood the local complexion or issues at stake. There are a number of ways we can do this, and they're basically five things that I want to cover. Firstly, the quick and dirty audit or service review, something called 5 Whys, process mapping, a personal favorite of mine, interviewing patients and staff using questionnaires, and then a fishbone diagram or Ishikawa diagram as it's known in QI speak. Now, in terms of a quick service review, what I mean over here is that this is sometimes referred to as an audit, but what you really want to do is you want to take about 20 to 30 patients with the condition in question and ask yourself a few questions going through 20 or 30 charts. Is the care acceptable? What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? Where are there delays in care? And from the end of that, you should have a pretty good idea of what the issues are that are at stake and what particular part of the issue you might be able to focus on for a quality improvement project. In front of you over here, you see the Jefferson Memorial. This was a really good example of the 5 Whys, where you just keep asking why each time you come up with a problem. And in this particular instance, a piece of masonry had fallen down and almost killed a tourist. So there was a conflab of the great and powerful, and they said, well, why is the Jefferson Memorial falling apart? And the first person they consulted was a chemist. The chemist said that it was a combination of the cleaning material and the jet fuel from the planes flying overhead. So the authorities thought, well, maybe we just need to move the airport. But they kept asking the question, well, why do we need to clean the monument so often? And it turned out there were a load of pigeons that particularly liked the Jefferson Memorial. Someone asked the question, well, why are there so many pigeons? Well, it turned out that the pigeons really liked spiders, and there were a lot of spiders on the Jefferson Memorial. And then someone asked the question, well, why are there so many spiders? And the spiders were particularly found the sand midges that flew up and settled on the monument particularly tasty. And when they asked a sand midge expert, it turned out that they particularly liked the fact that the monument was lit up and they were attracted to the lights. And the final solution was just to turn the lights on an hour or two later, and all of a sudden the problem evaporated. Here's another example of the 5 Whys. Why is John falling asleep? Because he's tired. Why is John tired? Because he's not getting enough sleep. Why is John not getting enough sleep? Because he's staying awake too long at night. Why is John staying awake too long at night? Because he's unable to fall asleep when he goes to bed. And why is he unable to fall asleep when he goes to bed? Well, he's spending half his time, or most of his time, on his iPhone. And here's another example from an acute care unit. There's a delay in patients being moved from the emergency unit to the ward. Why? Because there are no more beds in the ward. Why are there no beds in the ward? Well, there's still patients waiting to be discharged. Why? Because they're waiting for their medication and discharge documentation. Why? Because the healthcare assistant has not delivered the prescription to the pharmacy. And why has that not happened? Well, they're waiting for the nursing manager to initiate the process. The next thing I want to cover is process mapping. Process mapping can be as simple as using sticky notes and putting them up on a whiteboard, in which you look at a process and each step of a process one by one, and then put it together into something that looks a little bit like this. Here is an example of a process map. In this particular process, we're talking about managing a patient with sepsis. So in this instance, the triage nurse may or may not flag a patient to a nurse or physician. If they flag it to a physician, the patient gets registered, nurse performs an assessment. The nurse may or may not decide to draw some blood cultures, and then the nurse would ideally talk to a physician. And the physician at that point reviews with a consultant and decides whether or not to order antibiotics. And then ideally that physician then chats to the nurse and says, would you mind getting some antibiotics ready? And then finally, the patient receives the antibiotic. Now, if the triage nurse fails to recognize sepsis, there could be a wait. The patient would get registered at this point. They would have to wait for a cubicle where bloods could be taken. And then when the patient finally moves into the bed, the process continues. And then right at the top over here, we've got the ideal, which is the triage nurse goes to the physician and says, I'm really worried about this patient. We get an expedited registration, and the physician looks at them and goes, yeah, I think this patient needs antibiotics. They chat to the nurse and make an order. The nurse then goes and mixes up the antibiotic, and the patient gets their antibiotics. And if you're smart, what you can do is you can run a sort of service review, as we've talked about before, in parallel with the process map, and find out how long each part of these, how long a patient might take going through each of those processes, and from the moment that they arrive to the moment that they actually receive the antibiotic. Next is the Ishikawa diagram. And in this, what we look at is, it looks a bit like a fishbone, as it suggests. What you plan to do is write the full problem here in this box. And then coming off the spine, you've got a number of major causes. And in healthcare, those are generally going to map to staff. They're going to map to something around equipment, something around process, and something about the environment. So to use an example from earlier this year, there was an RSV outbreak. Before that, we had to sit down to think about some of the various factors that could contribute or potentially affect the pediatric ED's ability to cope. So in this instance over here, we've got obstacles to managing the RSV outbreak, and we've looked at staff, and there's some potential training gaps, shortage of doctors, staff sickness, issues with well-being. We've looked at process. Well, there's no triage guideline for managing RSV attendances. We haven't got a place for the really sick kids to go because maybe we don't have a pediatric HDU. We've got no hospital-wide protocol. There's no national guidance on how we should be managing this outbreak. And there's no kind of facility for ambulating these patients because we don't know what the criteria are. And then in terms of kit, we know we're going to have an increased oxygen demand. Do we have Optiflow or CPAP? Do we have potentially enough tests to do rapid RSV testing at the front door? And there may or may not be sufficient oxygen on the pediatric ward. And then finally, we've got things around environment and culture. So we know that EDs are already quite crowded. Perhaps there are bad relations between peds and the ED, and there are not enough doored cubicles from an infection control perspective. And one of the handy things that you can do when you've done an Ishikawa diagram is you've really been able to break down the various parts of the problem that are going to require addressing. And in so doing, you are often buying yourself both headspace to see where you might want to put your first intervention, but also you may actually decide that one member of your team would deal with one particular problem. So you could, for example, say, look, I don't know much about, I can't do much about the equipment, but I do know that the operational manager could potentially help me with getting a few more CPAP machines or really kind of help expedite the supply of RSV testing. And ideally at the end of that process, once of going through, whether it be process mapping or whether it be an Ishikawa diagram, you're going to come up with a really smart aim that really hits at the root cause of the problem that you're trying to address. So in summary, don't come up with solutions before analyzing the problem. There are loads of tools available to you and your team from at least, and you don't have to do all of them, but certainly pick one or two to really help you understand what it is that you're doing and what it is that you're trying to improve. And your aim should ideally flow out of your analysis of the problem. Thanks very much.